morning. Welcome to day 2 of Inside Security EMEA. My name is Sam Humphries. I will be comparing all of the sessions today, but on this one, I have the pleasure of presenting with my esteemed colleague, Mr. Richard Cassidy. We will start in just a second, give folks a minute or two to get on. I know we did have a few little challenges yesterday with Zoom being a little overcautious, but I can see the numbers are climbing nicely. Now, Richard has terrible lockdown hair, so is hiding. I may well do the same. Get my terrible lockdown.
Yeah, I'm thinking of going for a grade 1 at some point. I'm fed up with this hair.
I messed up my video as well, because, this three-tone looks really good. All right, I think we should get going. It's the right screen. Okay, so this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, or indeed this evening, if you're up very late, we are going to be talking about how to upcycle your current SIEM with Exabeam. If you are a CPE type person, you can potentially claim a CPE for attending the session, but please check out your ISC Square handbook for more information. We're running a passport to prizes for the entire event. So by showing up today, you've got 5 points for attending. Points equal prize draw entries. So the more that you interact with the event, the more points that you get. So if you want to go and visit our virtual booth afterwards, that will get you another 5 points. And if you access the content in the content section on the event site, for each piece of content that you download or access, you'll get 2 entries as well. We will have 5 winners announced before the end of the week. And the prizes they can choose from are Nintendo Switch Lites, Apple AirPods Pro, and Amazon gift vouchers. If you haven't done so yet, please register for the session later. We've got a really, really awesome packed agenda featuring James Birdseye, a self-confessed security geek who also happens to be a paramedic. He's awesome. Richard will be interviewing him. We have Exabeam customers, so you can come and ask some questions about what it's like to be an Exabeam customer. And then we have the amazing beer farmers who, if you've ever been to a B-Sides in the UK, and indeed some of the further afield ones, the beer farmers are super smart guys. They're very, very funny. But with their comedic entertainment, there is always a good security story kind of underneath the hilarity. So well worth coming to see. Everyone who attends, we will be donating to charity. You can choose your charity of choice from UNICEF's Global COVID-19 Emergency Appeal or NHS Charities Together. So please do go and sign up for that if you haven't already done so. Okay, quick introduction on me. So I'm Sam Humphries. I've been with Exabeam just over a year. I've been doing security for way too long, from the last century. I'm really into clouds. That's what Neverfile means, not anything else. If you require a DJ, I'm available part-time, social distancing rules apply. Very into old school malware. So if you want to have a chat on Sality or Config or really go way back, I'm your girl, fascinating at dinner parties. And I write and talk quite a lot. And please do come follow me on Twitter. Richard.
Well, Sam, I don't know if I can beat that introduction. I'll give it a go. I've been at Exabeam for about 2.5 years. And I work in security strategy with Sam. So similar to Sam, being 20 years in the industry, way back in the days of ASIC firewalling, when we jumped off of Linux servers doing, your standard kind of access lists, right through to various waves of, unified threat management and virtualization and network access control and all these wonderful technologies that have become mainstay in our environments today. That's kind of my history. I did spend a lot of time in SOC environments, so I've really come from a deep threat hunting, kind of threat persona hunting background. That's a kind of fancy way of saying trying to hunt down the bad guys, targeting sort of enterprise organizations. So I'll share some of those stories as part of this session. In my spare time, that little I have, I consider myself an artist in the field of martial affairs, not marital. I'll make sure that you're aware. And I coach rugby and referee at times. And I also moonlight sometimes in NHS ambulance, a bit of a hobby of mine, but more on that later when I interview James Birdseye. And like Sam, I like to write, I like to speak. And I'm hoping that the next big trend in coding is security. So let's see what happens over the next couple of years. Thanks, Sam.
So, all right. So this is what we're going to talk about today. Promises were made. We'll talk about why and how adding UEBA to your SIEM will supercharge your SOC, and it will. Correlation rules, there's certainly a place for them, but there are things that you just can't do with them, or they're very hard to do with correlation rules alone. We've got some real stories to tell you. So look forward to story time with Richard. And then we'll go into more about what an end-to-end augment project looks like, so you can kind of get a feel for exactly what happens during that process. So we call this upcycling. I think this is a great use for floppy disks. This was the Wikipedia description. Now, we're not saying that your SIEM is by any means a waste material, useless or unwanted, but I like the term creative reuse. SIEM's been around for a long time. It's not perfect, but we've seen time and time again the gains that customers get when they add in a UEBA product on top of their SIEM to really help with those analytics and drive things from a detection standpoint and also from an efficiency standpoint.
This is a completely fine approach to take to your data security requirements. It works, right? I mean, it may not be the most efficient of capabilities that you can implement, and to be fair, some of us are kind of stuck in the old ways of doing things. And it's not really because we want to be. It's kind of because the SIEM that we have in place, or the log management tool, has kind of grown into a mammoth of a tool that we really don't want to make changes to. And that's kind of what this is about, this webinar. It's that you don't really have to change what you've done already. There's better ways to augment how you've been doing things in the past.
Yeah, certainly more horses.
Oh, indeed, absolutely. Maybe a bigger chariot, who knows? For those that are into horticulture, and I'm rubbish at cutting my lawn, but I remember using these things, and some days you kind of go back to them. It's kind of similar in the SIEM world, right? You do want to go back into your SIEM to do things in the way that you used to do them, because there are certain processes that work well. But again, there are better ways, there are more efficient ways to achieve the same outcome, and that's kind of what this is all about.
Right, you ready for this? This is my favorite slide in the whole deck, right? Stand by. So let's. Sorry,
I love it.
I'm so easily pleased. So, anyone who's not 75 years old like Richard and I are, that was the original Batman. I was from way back, from the early series. So let's jump in our Stockmobile and let's go and have a look at how the world can be.
So Sam asked me when we were building this deck if you can only talk to one slide, and I think she only wanted me to talk to one slide, but I managed to twist her arm to talk to more. What would it be? And if I draw on my experience in security operations centers, right, as part of investigations teams, doing the typical audit reporting, compliance reporting through, terabytes and terabytes of data. And this kind of captures the biggest pain points that I've always experienced and that I am still seeing, talking to customers on a week-by-week basis here at Exabeam. The challenge is we've got so many data sets, and we're going to cover a little bit more about this later on in the presentation. And we've got to try to make sense of what those data sets are telling us. And correlation rules were kind of the first pass at that. But what analysts are really struggling to do is articulate the kind of chain of events across multiple data sets. Because at the end of the day, what we want that data to tell us is one or two things, right? Do I have a breach or a security incident, and am I compliant and in line with my audit requirements, right? So the security and audit, kind of the two sort of main drivers. So if you're not able to deal with those data sets in a sort of a time, sort of easy fashion, then you really are going to struggle to kind of get value, and you're going to be burning a great deal of cycles doing manual search and pivot. And therefore, the biggest question you have to ask is, are you creating timelines? And don't just think of timelines as security timelines. They can be audit timelines, compliance timelines. We even have in Exabeam human resources teams or HR teams, using the product to start building out a chain of events for leavers or new hires or potentially staff that are at risk. Timelines is what it all comes back to. Humans have this innate desire to be told a story, and we kind of articulate what's going on through those stories. So with the Exabeam platform, that's one of the key things we do, is we help organizations very easily build timelines to be able to combine all of these behaviors and all of these logged trails that are really telling us something is either happening or it isn't. And that's kind of the key that you really want to see from your existing SIEM platform, is show me the story behind the data so I can actually make sense of what it means in terms of my business risk. Next slide.
Hang on, I'm on the wrong window. There we go.
So I touched on it briefly there, right? What's the context? What's the issue that I may have sitting here in front of me in all of these data sets? And our esteemed colleague, Steve Moore, came up with the term time to answer. That's really what we're facing. If anything, from an alert or from an incident, we have to answer the question. And the question is, do I have to do something more with this? Do I have a case that I now have to escalate or start taking actions on? And just think about briefly the myriad of questions you're going to have to get answered very fast, and then apply that to how you're doing things today with traditional SIEM or log management tools. I mean, and I'll tell you about the ones that we're seeing right now in the COVID-19 sort of era. We're seeing significant amounts of failed logins. We're seeing significant amounts of failed VPN connections. And these are the two sort of big ones on people's minds at the moment in a SOC. Well, regardless of what one you look at, you're going to have to go and find out more information. You're going to have to answer more questions. And these are some of those questions you have to answer. The key one is what are the assets that are actually implicated in what's going on in this incident or this alert I got from my firewall or my authentication system. And then once you've got the asset, you're going to want to tie together who the person or what the credential was behind it. And that is notoriously difficult to do in a sort of reasonable period of time in traditional log management tools. But those two pieces of information give us a significant amount of context as to who and what we're dealing with, and whether really we should be thinking about escalating or potentially standing down our initial concern. And it doesn't stop there, right? Once you know what it is and what the credential is, then you've got to start thinking about all of the kind of business security, audit related questions. And we'll touch on this a little bit later when we talk about sort of how you build from the foundation of what you've got today and what are the things that are missing. But what happened before and after the event? Is it something I've seen before? Is it just implicated in this particular part of the environment? Does it spread to others? If you imagine if you introspect us on this webinar, how you do that today, just kind of cast your mind to that process of investigation, that search and pivot analysis. Is that truly scalable in a world where we're just going to see data sets increase exponentially? And the answer for most of us is, as much as it might be fun to kind of be the ninjas that we are within our existing log management tools and platforms, we want to spend more time doing the more interesting tasks, which are sort of the threat hunting tasks, the analysis of what's actually going on in terms of business context. That's really the finding the bad stuff, the fixing the bad stuff mantra that our SOC leads, our management, our sort of executive leadership team are really going to care about. And that's truly where the value to the business sort of lies. So yeah, consider your time to answer in what you're doing today.
Right, correlation rules. Right, as I said earlier, right, correlation rules have a place, certainly. They can be very useful, especially on the compliance side, I think. But when we see organizations regularly with thousands of these things, literally thousands, there's two fundamental challenges with correlation rules. You're either looking backwards at what's happened to you before and saying, well, hang on, we've seen this, this, and this. Let's set a rule. If this, then alert. That has some degree of use. Not always. Sometimes you'll see something once and once only. Sometimes the rules can be too loose and then they start firing and going off like a car alarm in a breeze, which means that you start ignoring them. Sometimes they'll never fire again. And it's very hard to go back and look at things and say, well, hey, we've never seen this do anything. Should we get rid of it? And that in itself is a big question to answer, because, what if it does fire again in the future? So you can end up with a lot of these things that are based on historical data with varying degrees of value. The other option is that you're looking into a possible future and think, well, this might happen. If it does, then fire. And that can be done from taking information from elsewhere where you've seen some threat intelligence. And you think, well, actually, if this does happen, I'd like to know about it. But again, with that, there is a degree of guessing, and it's not an exact science.
Well, so it bleeds in super well to what you've just mentioned. So going back to correlation rules, I have sat in front of organizations that have told me that they can get all the value of UEBA with their existing correlation rule approach. And And I don't disagree with that. But oh my goodness, the amount of effort you would burn to get to potentially, and I'm saying potentially the same outcome from a kind of an automated approach, a UBA approach, wouldn't be worth the effort, in my opinion. And then if you think about your standard sort of attack surface and your sort of your breaches, how many different techniques are used in a standard attack? Well, the fantastic Verizon data breach report said that on average there's about 20 plus different techniques used in your standard attacks. And by the way, all of that kind of comes back to credentials for 99% of them. We'll cover that in a moment. So consider how much baselining you would have to do, how much manual searching, pivoting you'd have to do in your correlation rules. And that's only on what you know to look for. And this is kind of where this picture really starts to ring true, right? Is investigations are quite simply a case of piecing together the jigsaw puzzle. And, as with all jigsaw puzzles, we kind of tend to go for the edges first. Well, I know I do. I can't speak for everybody on the call. And then try to work our way in from there. We don't necessarily know what we're kind of looking for, but we have an idea. And that's the biggest challenge in investigations. It's the things that you didn't think to ask or the picture you didn't think to look at that actually could represent possibly a foothold in a potential breach that you've missed, right? So there's a back door that you're not going to be able to close down. Or when it comes to making true sort of actionable decisions, where do you make those actions? How far has this particular incident spread? And we're not just talking security. We have customers using our platform on their existing sort of SIEM and log management data sets to build sort of analysis and pictures of things that are to do with business sort of context-based questions. And that's the challenge with investigations. You only know to investigate what you know, but actually the real truth of the story, the real crux of the problem can be in other data sets that you may not have considered to bring in. And that's always been a challenge in investigations, especially in threat hunting. And it's something that is very easily solved by a UBA platform.
How do you do count switches with correlation rules?
Well, the fact is, with a great deal of difficulty and most likely a huge degree of impossibility. I mean, that's the thing. If you're looking for account switches, well, you have to then say, well, for every single account that logs into the environment, I then want to triage when the asset that account is logged into logs into another account. Well, how many times does that happen in a day? I mean, applications have different authentication frameworks that they adhere to. So I may log in as our Cassidy, but then I may have other authentication mechanisms to other applications. So you're going to have to manually track every single authentication per asset, which doesn't really tell you much other than that asset's logging into multiple destinations. Doesn't necessarily mean account switching. It doesn't. So you kind of get the gist of the issue. With correlation rules, looking for things like account switches, which are your biggest pain point when it comes to security problems. Because if we know anything about hackers over the past 20, 30 years, and I'm sorry to use the term hackers, we should really be saying attackers.
I'm in the hacker jar.
Exactly the attacker sort of bandwagon. It's that they switch accounts. They privilege escalate. This is what their mainstay is. You can't do a great deal of damage outside of kind of DDoS without privileges. So yes, account switches and correlation rules, if I haven't harped on enough, is impossible to really do efficiently.
Yeah. If you've attended any of the other sessions over the last day, yesterday, you may have seen one of the demos where there's been an account switch over to the SA account, and then tracking like what the SA account's doing on an SQL server and realizing that that's somebody else doing that with a correlation rule. Not easy. Screen again. There we go. Right. This is where I think we get into the meat of the sandwich. Is everyone sitting comfortably? Because it's time for story time with Richard Cassidy.
This is where I feel, Sam, I should be in my garden on a chair, with a book in my hand. But anyway, we'll spare you that picture. So look, I've been involved in these projects for probably the last 8-9 years. I want to talk about some really interesting cases that I've sort of been involved in the last 12 months. If you look at these text boxes on the slide, I mean, these are some of the consistent challenges that we're sort of going into customer environments with, right? And they've got their existing SIEM or log management platform, and they're still facing the challenges that tool was meant to help solve. So let me give you one example. So a large finance organization, in fact, this story I could probably rerun about 3 times for 3 different large financial organizations. they all had a very, very popular, widely deployed log management platform. And, they've built a significant amount of correlation rules to kind of do all sorts of weird and wonderful things, like looking at account lockouts, access on particular port ranges that they shouldn't be seeing between particular network segments, development teams using correlation rules to kind of look for application errors and all these sorts of wonderful things, IT ops, SysOps, security ops. But actually, what ended up happening with these organizations was that they were sitting on the correlation rule alerts, firing at a rate of sort of knots, and the signal to noise ratio was just simply became unmanageable. Right, the teams were struggling. The SOC teams were starting to come in and try to save the SysOps team, and it became a real nightmare. And that's the issue, right? These traditional SIM platforms do what they do well. The SIM tools are there to take vast amounts of data and to allow you to start searching, pivoting, and articulating things that you want to articulate. When it comes to security, when it comes to kind of business intelligence, you have to take a different approach. So these particular organizations started sort of looking at things from the sort of top 5 security standpoints that they felt were critical to their business. And actually, they're very similar across both organizations. They wanted to be able to take all security alerts that were fired from the correlation rules and start to make sense of what was going on there, right? Which were the true security alert problems versus which weren't, without having to do any manual search and pivot. The other one was looking at all credentials access, right? Who's logging on to what, where they're logging on, what times, and baselining what's normal and what's abnormal. They also wanted to look at alerts coming from endpoint tools, right? They're one of the noisiest log sources you could possibly have. And that and DLP was the fourth. Again, there's so many alerts coming from these endpoints. How do I know which alerts I should really care about? And more importantly, and the fifth, and these are in no particular order, is just tell me when I get something firing from a correlation rule, what is the asset that I'm dealing with, or assets, because it can be multiple, and what are the credentials that are implicated on those assets in this particular incident. And again, as Sam mentioned in the previous slide, there can be multiple credentials being used in a particular type of activity. So for these financial organizations, it was about reducing the load on their SOC team and starting to build a picture of what's going on. And that all wraps itself up very nicely into automated timelines. Moving into kind of the aviation industry, this is where we've seen a massive kind of shift to cloud-based platforms over the past sort of 12, 24 months. And that's a very, very difficult task for most organizations to achieve. And I say that with experience because if I look at some of the traditional log management platforms, there is a lot of limitation in their ability to be able to connect to cloud APIs, infrastructure platform or SaaS. And actually, a lot of those tools will give you a software development kit to be able to develop your own API frameworks. APIs themselves aren't that difficult to understand. And if you're pretty good at coding in various languages, you can kind of build them. But then you've got to think about the hundreds and thousands of cloud platform applications out there. You have to then become an expert in every API. And that's just not a task that organizations like aviation or finance or manufacturing or retail, whatever industry you're in, you should be taking on. What you care about is I need to be able to retrieve all this data from my Office 365, from my SharePoint, from my Zoom, video conferencing environment, whatever it might be. And I want a platform to tell me when something is occurring or when something is not. So for the aviation customer that I'm referring to, being able to use Exabeam to plug in without having to do the work to their cloud platforms and pull that data in to a cloud platform, because Exabeam is delivered as a SaaS also, meant that they were able to completely shift away from this kind of old on-prem, massive sprawl of hardware and data storage requirements to a much more scalable, flexible cloud deployment model. And across all of these customers I've talked about, the key sort of deliverables that they were really looking for was, can you automate my investigation and analysis to a degree where I don't have to spend a huge amount of time anymore? My analysts can get, working on the things that are far more interesting, and that kind of helps with staff retention and a few other things around that. But can I also make sure that what I'm getting from my original data sets sitting in my SIM, that it's business context, that I have a story of events that allows me to actually make decisions and not have to go back and question myself once, twice, or three times or more. So they're two kind of common themes that I've been seeing over the past 12 to 24 months. And Sam, I know you've got a phenomenal hot off the press story to share with everybody, which I'm going to hand over to. So fire away.
Actually, thank you. Before I go into the late breaking news, and this was a story that came in last night, we had a bit of feedback from one of the participants who wanted to see something a bit more solid. So I'm going to jump to the next slide and then we'll do late breaking news. Okay, so this is a case study that's available on our website. FEMSA are a huge company in Latin America. They're the biggest distributor of Coca-Cola products. There's a lot more that they do. Their IT security chief, Rek Nieto, presented at our customer conference Spotlight last year about the real-time savings that his organization have seen since implementing Exabeam. There's a great video. It's an hour of his presentation. There is also a written case study if you prefer to go and look at that. But these are some of the real operational gains that they saw very, very quickly after implementing our UEBA solution. So the team had an SLA to respond back to their customers, their internal customers, within 60 minutes. And they were missing that SLA pretty regularly. Their average time to respond was 74 minutes. So considerably outside of the 60 minutes that they put in place. Once they installed Exabeam, that dropped very, very quickly to 43 minutes. So you can see there a very tangible gain on that response time from an operational point of view. The team also had to produce a report every single hour on some of the network traffic that was going on. Creating that report with their original solution was taking them between 60 to 90 minutes. So the hourly report wasn't really happening so much. Once they'd implemented our solution, that dropped down to 8 minutes to create the same report. So they were able to provide that report out to the stakeholders on a much more timely manner. And also they're not wasting time doing that manual work, whereas it's what they were doing before. The cool kind of buzzword, 0 days. They weren't seeing 0 days all the time, but when they did, it was normally taking them a couple of days, maybe 3 days to be able to pick those up. Within the first few weeks of having Exabeam solutions installed, they were picking up stuff same day, which is massive. If you think about that in terms of risk, being able to pick something up that quickly, 2 to 3 days in security terms is a long time. And dwell times are still way off the charts. But very, very tangible gains that you can see there. Real customer, real video. You're very welcome to go and have a look at it. Rat has been a good proponent of Exabeam, and it's a great talk that he does. So if you're involved in running the SOC from an operational business, you can see the real gains that his organization have made.
Sam, before you jump into
Yes.
the breaking news, 0 day exploit detection, right? When you hear that, you almost wonder if that's, how can you possibly say that your 0 day exploit detection comes from 2 to 3 days down the same day? Well, look, we all know that attackers haven't really changed their TTPs per se so much, right? I mean, regardless of how they break in, we all know credentials are the biggest target. How they get credentials is a myriad of tools and techniques, right? It's malware over email, it's exploit kits on websites, but at the end of the day, 0 day is going to be a new C2 connection that you haven't seen before. It's going to be a credential that privilege escalates and accesses a system that it shouldn't have done before. It's going to be an endpoint tool telling you that some software is run that we don't recognize in the organization. So detecting 0 day with correlation rules is actually quite difficult, if not impossible. But when you start applying that kind of UEBA lens, you start to find those anomalies in the haystack very quickly. So I just wanted to sort of bring some honesty to that same day zero exploit detection. It is possible, even if you think it isn't.
So my late breaking news story. Thank you, Richard. So this came in last night. This is, again, a real customer story. I can't share the customer name, but we did an augment onto what you would probably refer to as a next-gen SIEM, certainly a leader in the SIEM space. The customer was struggling with it operationally, and they brought in Exabeam to bring in all of the things that we've just talked about, right? There's operational gains, there's detection gains. And this has happened within 1 week of purchase. So they saw one of the notable users light up pretty quickly. It was a network engineer. So network engineers, generally have reasonable access rights. And all of a sudden, lots of risk points had been assigned to that network engineer's account. Now, we had the feed coming in from the SIEM and one more log source. That was it. So, there wasn't that we'd spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks pulling in different data sources, which, as you'll see when we get onto the next piece, actually it doesn't take weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to do that. 2 data sources coming in. One was their original SIEM. We saw extra points of risk all of a sudden bubbling up on this user account. Started to investigate very, very quickly. Turns out that user account had done over 50 account switches in a very short space of time. Trying to log on to different assets, jumping from asset to asset. Nothing else had fired at this point. There was nothing coming from the original SIEM. There was nothing coming from the endpoints. 5 hours later, we started to see detection coming up from their endpoints for Mimikatz. So 5 hours, the original SIEM still hasn't fired. We've picked this up already. The endpoint's still not picking anything up either. That's within 1 week of deployment. So if you think about normally with behavior analytics solutions, there's a degree of baselining that's required to be able to understand what normal looks like. In 1 week, that is huge, huge value and clearly something very, very dodgy going on. So late breaking news, real story. So, it's important to understand these from a customer point of view. And this isn't marketing fluff. This is real stories from real customers. Anything else to add, Richard, before I jump to the next slide?
No, I think you covered that great. And we'll touch on that a little bit more as we go through kind of what does it look like taking your existing SIEM and augmenting with UEBA.
Yeah. Now, you've done a lot of these, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think it'd be important for folks on the phone to understand what does this look like really from kind of the first few conversations of us going in. Customers are saying they've got the challenges that we know we can solve. Obviously, the foundations are key. What are those conversations? How they start, Richard, and kind of how do you build out from there when you're thinking about a deployment and augment project?
What's interesting is a lot of customers you talk to seem to think this augmentation project is going to be as complicated as it was to implement their SIEM log management tool. And honestly, in all cases, that is not true. Augmentation is essentially taking all your hard work, right? You've done the hard work, you've put in the foundations, you've set up your log capturing capabilities, whether it's Windows Event Forwarding, whether it's direct syslog from all your endpoints, whatever, however you're doing it, agent-based collection for your remote sites and everything in between. That's the hard part, right? If you've invested time and effort into building that, you're 80%, maybe 90% of the way there. Once we've kind of got a good picture of what the log sources are, one of the things we tend to help you with is, are you logging stuff that actually makes sense to log, right? Because what's interesting is we see a lot of customers log for the sake of it. And don't get me wrong, there is a lot of audit requirements to log a lot of things. But when we remove the audit needs out, we look at what's left, there's still a great deal of information. You kind of got to question what's valuable from a security business context perspective. And you'll be quite surprised to find that in most SIEM augmentation projects, we tend to come in and help you possibly cut down a significant amount of log sources, or at least the verbosity levels of the logs that you were collecting. And that in turn reduces your log collection requirements. But once you've got an understanding of that, then the next step is simply a case of understanding what it is the business needs to see. What's the context you're trying to build? Because the platform is doing a lot of the analysis, in fact, all of it automatically. You don't have to configure anything per se. We just have to get the log data into the UEBA platform and then start validating out the things that you're looking for. We'll talk a little bit about this in the next slide. In my genuine experience, we're seeing customers spin up a SIEM augmentation play in a matter of days. And by the end of sort of day 4 or 5, they're starting to see the use cases fire. And actually everything in between that they perhaps weren't expecting, that it's still very, very sort of important and very valid from a sort of time to answer business context perspective. So actually what it looks like is not as complex as you thought. Getting data into the SIEM platform is not complex whatsoever. And a lot of organizations are worried about the sort of, well, I have cloud or I have on-prem and I have other business units that I need to connect into and third-party connections. That's not an issue from a SIEM augmentation perspective. The challenge is always, have you got the data in the first place? And are the data sets that you're using valid? And before we move on to the next slide, there was a finance customer I was working with and still am, that took a really fresh approach to their log management strategy. It's not something I've seen before, but I absolutely bought into to the ethos. Is for every business unit or department that wants to send logs into their existing SIEM platform, they have to essentially validate why those logs are important, right? Because the log everything approach isn't always the best approach. You can create far too much noise from data that just makes no sense at all or has no value. So if you take the approach of validating and sort of questioning whether I should have the log data in, you get a much more sensible output from your various business units and teams, and you actually get log data in your log management platform and tools that becomes infinitely more useful, whether it's just traditional correlation rules, but also from an augmentation play. Yeah. So what does the augmentation project look like? I mean, if you were to start yours today, what's the journey that you'd go through? And these are the standard steps that Exabeam take our customers through. And actually, a lot of these are great steps in just validation of what business really needs versus kind of what it should be looking for from the existing data sets. But if we start at deployment and planning, the key thing is, and Sam, if you give us our red boxes as we go through, is architecture and design, right? And I talked about this a little bit earlier. A lot of organizations are kind of concerned about how they connect the cloud and the on-prem dots and everything in between. And our job is to help sort of take you on that journey, explain where it is we need to see log data from, and demonstrate how easy it is to get that data into the platform. And that's, a couple of hours, a half a day kind of affair. And it's actually a very good kind of self validation part of the process to start looking and questioning at, what have you got into the platform? What are your potential blind spots? And then bringing that in as needed from a deployment planning perspective. Then you kind of move on to implementation. So once we know where your existing SIM tool sits, where all the log data is coming in, and how we're going to transport that into the platform, then it's really the next part is super important, right? It's about how do we make sure we've got user-based context, right? Because we see a lot of organizations still logging more or less sort of traditional kind of network-based security analysis tool data. So they're logging all the DDoS kind of alerts. They're looking at the firewall policy rule sets, permit or deny, and on all these things. And a lot of organizations we talk to are missing a great deal of user context. They've got identity access management tools that they're not bringing into their existing log management platform or as effective as they thought. They've got cloud access management solutions, Cassidy products, things like this, that are all logging in their own kind of silos, but not being correlated in any way to add that user context. Because again, going back to 99% of breaches, it involves a credential. So if we're not getting credential data from all the context sources that are out there, then that's a massive blind spot that isn't going to help you in the long run, especially not in the latest automated attack capability that we're seeing attackers have. And then it's a case of configuring those platforms, right? Plugging them in. And it's simply a case of pointing their log outputs to your existing SIM tool. And then the Exabeam platform is able to take that data from your SIM or log management function. And actually, it can work in a hybrid mode. And this is the key thing, right? You may not have everything in your SIM tool because for whatever reason, it can be licensing issues. It can be volume-based issues. With Exabeam, you have the ability to log directly to our platform where you're trying to save yourself money and headache on licensing and volume costs with your existing tool. So there is the ability to kind of deploy in that hybrid mode if you wish. And we'll talk about the sort of cloud functionality in a little bit. So once you've got past implementation, and you're kind of talking on average 2 to 3 days, and it would only hit 3 if we're really starting to see maybe some challenges with getting some of the log data out of the traditional SIM. But if everything's set up and validated, which it normally always is in my experience, it's a 2 or 3 day process to kind of implement. And now, of course, that does depend on how big you are as an organization. It can be longer, of course, if you're, a 100,000 user business. But for your kind of average orgs, anywhere between sort of 5,000 to 10,000, it isn't a very significant implementation timeline. And then you get to the real critical place, which is customization and testing. And I think if you cast your mind back to where you are today with correlation rules, where you have been, validating the use cases those correlation rules should be delivering is a big, big challenge, right? Because you may get your black and white answers, or you might have multiple Boolean logic expressions going on. I want to see this and this or that in this particular time frame. But what does that mean in terms of time to answer in terms of context, security, compliance, audit. This is one of the key parts of an augmentation sort of implementation project. It's saying, well, let's validate that the data we're bringing in is actually making sense and usable from a UEBA perspective. And here's where probably the biggest pain points lay with organizations. If data that's coming in isn't parsed correctly, then 9 times out of 10, you have to create the parser or you have to edit the parser. And that's simply just not scalable. That's broken. And at Exabeam, that's one of the things that we provide as part of our platform service is we create the parsers for our customers, right? We don't want you to have to be stuck in parser creation world. Now, if you like to create your own parsers, the platform has the ability to let you do that. It's not very difficult to do, but you don't have to do that as part of validating the data that's coming in. And then you've got to think about, right, now the data's in, it's being parsed, is it actually making any sense? And to Sam's sort of breaking news story, we find that with just 3 log sources, right? So your user authentication data, your asset context and security alert data, that out of the box, Exabeam is firing, north of 70% of its content, which is, millions of model variations and, several hundred kind of risk-based analysis rules. And that's just with a very small set of data. And we know that if you've already gone through a SIEM project, a log management project, you've got way more than 4 log sources sitting in your existing SIEM tool. So thinking about the value you're going to get from an implementation perspective, it's going to be fairly high for most organizations today with an existing SIEM and log management platform. And then to kind of wrap it all up and the finalization phase, it's simply a case of saying, right, well, now this tool's in place, let's make sure that our organization business can use it. And one of the great things about the Exabeam platform is because it presents the data in such an easy to understand intuitive format with sort of with our timelines, with our ability to bring in other log sources automatically, stitch it into what the user's doing, what the asset's doing, showing the connections between the two, and then the ability to start doing things like automated response and incident management handling. You actually find that your SOC analysts and your SOC practitioners are very familiar with how the tool operates out of the box because it's the kind of functions they've been trying to achieve with the existing log management tool. So the training phase, it tends to be a magnitude of a day or two, if that, because it's such a simple product to understand because of how it presents the data sets. Sam, I think a good sort of slide to sort of wrap up the kind of message when we talk about upcycling your existing SIEM. At the end of the day, we kind of look at the box on the left-hand side, right? And a lot of organizations are coming to Exabeam to improve threat detection, right? Because they're struggling with the existing challenges that we've discussed throughout this entire webinar. And that is making sense of all the data sets they've got. And that's really what the analytics platform is about from Exabeam. It's about taking all of these variable inputs, all of these data sources, and doing some very critical things, stitching the data back to users and credentials and the assets that those users and credentials are accessing, and then stitching into those timelines everything that's happening on the asset or the credential. So now what you get is a story that tells you what happened before, during, and after the event. Automatically, you don't have to go and ask those questions. And then that feeds into some other very critical parts of the product in terms of platform functions. So once you've got that visibility, then you start to get to a point where, you're able to respond significantly quicker to incidents that are going to be firing. And remember, you're going to be seeing a lot of context you haven't seen before in a way that isn't going to suck significant amounts of time. Don't think for a second by turning on UEBA, you're going to give yourself a new problem, right? Whereas, oh my goodness, now I've got more incidents to handle than I had correlation rules. That's not the case, right? The incidents that you're going to be seeing in the Exabeam platform will be essentially a sort of convergence of potentially hundreds of correlation rules into one simple timeline. But then with the incident response functionality, you have the ability to start creating playbooks. And this is a real key part, right? Where analytics gives you the visibility into the problem, actually taking actions is the challenge. So from a SOAR perspective, Exabeam gives you the tools to create, playbooks from your manual playbook functions. We have a lot of out-of-the-box playbooks that you can use around phishing and malware and so on and so forth. So we're trying to make it very easy for the organizations to start then using the sort of computer, right, the CPU, to do a lot of the heavy lifting tasks to get you to a point where your SOC team, your sort of audit teams are able to focus on the real challenges and the real issues. And then you get to what happens when I'm looking at shifting entirely to the cloud, or I'm starting to adopt the cloud sort of platforms, SaaS or infrastructure as a service options that I may not have wanted to at the speed I'm having to do so now in the kind of COVID-19 era. How do you bring that data in? And I did talk earlier about organizations really struggling to bring in lots of different cloud source data. Well, again, out of the box, that's something that should be there in any analytics platform, in any UEBA tool, is the ability to pull in what you're doing in cloud today. So bringing that in and also your on-prem data is really, really important piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And then at the end of the day, you want to decrease your logging costs, right? We don't want to be constantly beaten over the back of the head with the stick of, well, if you add in your EDR logs, that's going to be a license cost increase of X. You shouldn't be penalized for wanting to be more secure, right? And this has been a phrase in the industry for quite some time, but it seems to have been missed a lot on the traditional SIEM sort of log management platform players. With Exabeam, we don't want that to be a challenge. And I mentioned earlier, if you have those issues with your existing log management tool and you want to bring in additional log data, EDR is a great example, then you can do that. And with Exabeam, we're not charging you based upon the amount of log data you're bringing into the platform. It's a user-based licensing model. So it significantly allows you to decrease your logging costs whilst not sacrificing your security and compliance needs. And then we get to the kind of final piece, and a lot of organizations are doing this in weird and wonderful ways, right? What about archiving? And today, kind of archiving comes in one or two options, right? You either build a complete mirror of your existing organization, which is a kind of a DR strategy for business continuity perspective, but that's double the cost. I mean, if you take your existing SIEM, you're doubling what you have to do to get a true kind of DR archive functionality, or you're taking massive snapshots of your data and archiving it off to cold storage. And then the challenge is you've got to bring that back in at some point to then search through the data historically. And if you work in finance, if you work in government, you're going to realize that pain point, because how many times you've been asked to go back a year or two and bring in a week's worth or a month's worth of activity for a particular user or asset. Bringing in data from cold storage is painful. So again, with Exabeam, we developed our cloud archive platform, which allows customers to essentially archive off the data that's coming into the Exabeam's solution and have it sitting there readily searchable. So you can search that data in minutes to find, data points that extend over, multiple years without having to re-import it into an existing platform, without having to take on the pain of having additional hardware sat there ready to go. Upcycling your SIEM with Exabeam and taking on that journey is not a painful one, and it actually gives you a significant amount more functionality than you would have considered that you'd had in your existing SIEM log management tools. And Sam, I know I've talked a lot there. I don't know if you want to add any points to that part.
No, you've been very verbose, my friend. All right. I know we've got some questions in the chat. If any folks do have more questions, you can ask them in the Q&A. Just want to do a quick next steps point of view. If you would like to have a look at the product, if you've got more technical questions beyond this session, on the main event site, there is a chat bot. It looks like a robot. It's got real people behind it, I promise you. So the team are ready to help answer your questions. We can jump on a demo, whatever it is you'd like to see. If you jump over to that chat bot, one of the team will be there to assist you. So let's have a look at the questions. We've got a few that have come through in the chat. Just if you're on and you think of something, Q&A is the place to go. So let's see what we've got here. The implementation looked fairly straightforward. You talked about some days. How long on average would that full implementation end-to-end take?
Again, it does depend mainly on the size of your organization and kind of the existing sort of spread of your SIEM log management tool. What I will tell you on average that I've seen over the past 2.5, 3 years at Exabeam is you're looking at a 7 to 14 day end-to-end implementation plan. The implementation part's the easy part, right? Spinning up the platform, whether from a SaaS perspective, which is where a lot of our customers are now going to, we can have that spun up in hours, right? And then you can be ingesting data in on the same day. The bit that takes the time is the validation, right? Are we seeing the right log data? Are you happy with the use cases that are firing? Are you getting the value you look for? So, customers are doing that within a week. Some are taking a bit longer because they want to go through extra validation. And the longest I've seen for the most complex, and I'm talking 65,000 user organization, spread across Asia, EMEA, North and South America, are doing a kind of very verbose 3-month implementation project and deployment plan, but no more than that, genuinely. So, 1 to 2 weeks is kind of your average. Worst case, if you're a significant size organization, you're looking at about a 3-month kind of end-to-end implementation plan.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, there's a couple more here. Can I augment my cloud SIEM?
Oh, that's a great one. So the answer is yes, to start off simply. How you do it is even more straightforward. So from an Exabeam perspective, if you've got data sitting in an existing cloud SIEM platform, then we have the ability to take that data, to bring it into our UEBA platform, and start giving you the value in terms of security and compliance use cases straight out of the box. And again, if you're finding your existing cloud SIEM is going to be too costly to kind of upscale additional log sources, then you can kind of run a hybrid mode, as I talked about earlier, where you have Exabeam doing a lot of the analysis for what's in your existing cloud SIEM, and then connecting via our Cloud Connector framework into all your additional tools that perhaps you don't want to be paying significant amounts of money to bring into your traditional cloud SIEM, but bringing it into Exabeam. So absolutely, it's something we're seeing a lot of our customers do.
Yeah, I think the Cloud Connectors piece is super powerful. We had a question yesterday in one of the sessions just around, all the different things that we can interact with. We've got, I think, over 300 different integrations now. So covering all sorts of things from traditional security products to the network logs and stuff that we talked about, but also a lot of business tools as well. Like we recently brought out a Cloud Connector for Zoom, as an example. Workday. There's so much we can plug into that can suit different use cases. Be that around inside a threat. I know is a very big blanket term, and there's a session coming up on inside a threat as it happens. But between Cloud Connectors and the other integrations, there's so much that we can talk to. And absolutely, cloud SIMs are one of those things, or some of those things. Okay, one more here. What sort of deployment options do I have? You've mentioned SaaS already. So the nice thing about Exabeam is that we pretty much cover all bases. So you can install on-prem if you wish. I know on-prem's a little difficult right now for some folks because we're not allowed to see other people. You can put it in your own cloud. We can host it in an Exabeam SaaS cloud solution, which is available in 15 countries. And if you are a smaller organization, or you have it doesn't necessarily mean a smaller organization, but you have a small security team, we have a whole host of partners as well that offer various degrees of management, from managing the solution from an infrastructure point of view, whereas you still do the security operations piece, through to like MDR style services wrapped around. So it's, while nothing is completely hands off, awful lot of that day-to-day stuff up to and including threat hunting and incident response is managed by partner. Okay, so just a reminder, if you would like to have a look through the product, the folks are waiting in the event area. You pop back, I'll just go back slide to the chat bot that isn't a bot. It's a real person, it's real people. Oh, there might be another question that's come in. Let me just jump over to that 1 second. What's the most important differentiator between Splunk and QRadar? How to talk to their existing customer on SIEM augmentation? I'm guessing that's from possibly one of our partners that's on. So I think a lot of the things that we've already covered are really the big differentiators. I know we can talk about things like logging costs, but I think the operational value and the detection capabilities are really the big things that we can bring to an organization running some of those alternative SIEM solutions. Richard, did you have anything to add to that?
We have these conversations a lot, as you can appreciate, and you've mentioned some of the usual suspects that we're sort of working with. The thing about these existing log management platforms is they are great at doing just that, right? They're fantastic log management tools. But when you start looking at trying to get true security value out of these platforms, it creates a lot of headache. When we try to get general purpose log management tools to build security sort of timelines to start bringing context in that helps us show lateral movement, sort of things that we wouldn't have known before, without a correlation rule to do that, it's nigh on impossible. So these tools are very good at giving you they're very easy to get data in. You can build dashboards, visual reports. But when we start looking at the true security value, as Sam mentioned, it's a very manual search and pivot process. So that's the kind of key differentiator. When you look at UEBA, it's about taking you to that next level of insights. And in fact, I say next level, the level of insights you've kind of been looking for all along when it comes to kind of security and security operations. And that's the biggest differentiator. So for any organization that's struggling with alert overload, with trying to make sense of what's actually going on, with trying to threat hunt more effectively, with trying to stay one step ahead of zero-day activity or complex credential-based attacks, you can't do that in traditional log management platforms. You genuinely can't. I've been in this industry for 20 years since SIEM's been around, and I've never seen a tool do that effectively until we've come into the UBA era. So Sam, to kind of just echo what you've said, really.
Yeah, I think, if people ask me to describe Exabeam in one sentence, I think ultimately it comes back to time. That's the biggest thing. Time is such a precious commodity in security operations. And if you're sat there doing a lot of manual work, investigations can take, hours and hours and days in some cases, and we're presenting this information to you automatically so that you're not, spending that much time digging around. You'll be able to get hands-on and actually deal with the problem itself. And ultimately understanding what's happened means that you can then think about it from a strategic point of view, and put in maybe like different controls to prevent something happening again in the future.
A great question. Thank you.
Okay, on that note, thank you, Richard. As ever, it's a pleasure presenting with you.
You too, Sam.
So our next session is on Insider Threat at 1 o'clock UK time. And if you would like to come along to the charity session at 4 o'clock, we'd love to see you there. Thank you, everyone, for attending.